Welcome to our Masterclass series. And everyone, welcome to today's Ideas Masterclass, organized under the Office of Interdisciplinary Studies at the UP Jindal Global University. So Ideas provides a unique space for interdisciplinary learning and research. It brings together students, faculties, and practitioners to address pressing global challenges through collaboration and critical inquiry. It is a dynamic center for incubator of interdisciplinary research and innovative pedagogy and focuses on building connections across disciplines to address complex development challenges globally, fostering partnerships, nurturing talent, and producing impactful scholarship. And this interdisciplinary focus is essential for tackling complex problems and challenges of development. And our one-year MSc Development Practice course is a non-restriction program designed for those interested in exploring and addressing pressing issues in countries of the Global South, such as economic growth, climate change, and social inequality. This course combines rigorous theoretical study with opportunity for practical field-based engagement. Our curriculum blends theoretical rigor and skill-based learning with intensive fieldwork and prepares students for impactful career in development research, policy making, and social entrepreneurship. And a key part of our MSc program is our Masterclass seminar series. And these sessions features distinguished scholars, experts, and professionals from a diverse range of backgrounds. Our masterclass sessions aim to expand students' horizons by connecting classroom learning to real-world experiences in development, policymaking, academia, and social work. And masterclasses are spaces and opportunities for our students who are present here now for this masterclass to connect what's learned in class with the experience of experts working on development on ground, on policy and social change. So students are encouraged to critically reflect, discuss, and deepen their understanding of how complex change happens in diverse settings. And today's sessions exemplifies this approach. We'll today hear from Dr. Amogh Dhar Sharma, who is an Economic and Social Research Council postdoctoral fellow at the University of Oxford. He's a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at the University of Oxford, affiliated with the Department of International Development. His research examines the intersection between technology and democracy, focusing especially on political campaigns and communication strategies, the digital innovation in South Asia. Today, he'll discuss his book, The Backstage of Democracy, India's Election Campaigns and the People Who Manage Them. So I request Amogh to start his presentation, and we are eagerly waiting to hear what he has to say. Unfortunately, our discondant, who is supposed to be here, could not be present because of personal emergency, but we'll take this masterclass further and open up this session. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Dr. Mohanty. I must apologize that I've just gotten over a cold, so there might be some bouts of coughing in the middle. So please excuse me for that.
Yeah,
and also thank you so much.
Right. Yeah.
And also thank you so much for Prachi for this kind invitation. I'm really excited to talk to an audience of scholars and students who are working on development practice. I did my PhD, and this book came out of a PhD that I did in the Department of International Development. And I've often said this in the past, and I'll say this again, that, this research could have been done in the Department of Political Science, Sociology, or some other discipline-based department, and it would have seen the light of day, but it would have been a different body of work. And I think what's so exciting to be speaking to an interdisciplinary audience of scholars who look at development in the most broadest sense of the term is that you start looking at interlinkages, right? So while in what I have to talk about today, politics, elections will be quite front and center, but I don't reify myself as a political scientist purely, right? I look at the interconnections between what's happened in India's economy in the post-liberalization era, the impact that had on people's sociological attitudes, and how that's impacted politics, right? So as I think scholars of development studies, it's exciting because we take seriously these interlinkages rather than being too discipline bound. So without much further wait, I'm going to share my screen. And Prachi, can I look to you to tell me if I'm exceeding the time limit?
Yeah, sure.
Would that be fine?
I'll keep a note. Yeah, definitely.
Awesome. And that's viewable, I'm sure?
Yes, very clearly. Thank you.
Awesome.
It's clear.
Great.
Yes.
So yeah, this is my book, The Backstage of Democracy, India's Election Campaigns and the People Who Manage Them. This is a book about election campaigns in India. It's a book about how election campaigns in India are changing. And the story of change is one, I argue, that can be called as the professionalization of politics. And I'll explain what I mean by this term in a second. But in the time that I have here today, I want to do three things. Firstly, I want to talk to you about what are the intellectual motivations behind this book. And the reason why I want to get into this is that I want to explain why the timing of this book, I believe, is so important. Whether or not people buy the argument is for the readers to judge, but why I think professionalization has happened at a certain juncture in India's democracy is something I want you to be the is what I want to be the biggest takeaway from what I have to talk about today. Why is professionalization taking place now? Why not any sooner? Why not any later? And what does that say about the state of India's democracy today and where we're headed? Second, I want to talk about, and this is one of the core arguments of the book, that why did this thing called professionalization take place? What I'm calling professionalization has been seen in other parts of the world. And my approach in this book is to ask, what does a developing country like India contribute to theory, right? So we should not see developing countries as simply as a state of exception where theories from the West, where experiences of democracy from the West go wrong. But rather, I'm really interested in being part of an approach that theorizes from the global South, that looks at how developing countries contribute to something far more general that scholars in the West should take seriously. And finally, I'll only have time to touch upon this briefly, but really to talk about how professionalization manifests itself and where the direction of travel really is with this. So let's start with an anecdote that will hopefully help clarify what really got me started in this project. And the anecdote really comes a decade old when a lot of what I'm calling professionalization really started to appear in front of our eyes. So this story is from 2016, August 2016, when Uttar Pradesh was gearing up for its then upcoming 2017 Legislative Assembly elections. And early in the morning of one morning in August 2016, Sonia Gandhi arrived in Varanasi, Prime Minister Modi's home turf, to launch and she was then the president of the Indian National Congress, the Congress Party, to launch the Congress Party's campaign for the UP elections. And the idea was that the campaign would be launched through a roadshow. So she arrived in the early hours of the morning at Varanasi airport. There you had thousands of party workers greeting her with slogans and party flags. Then, as her roadshow began and started going towards the streets of Varanasi, you had roughly 1,000 bikers who jumped on their bikes and they sort of rode along with her as a show of protest. Then, of course, these are visuals from that day. Hundreds of thousands of people came out. You can see the streets were chock-a-block. Here she is, sort of throwing rose petals and at Dr. Ambedkar's statue, greeting party workers and functionaries, so on and so forth. Now, you might look at all of this and you might argue, what's new here? Roadshows are as old as India's democracy. There's no professionalization here per se. But something interesting happens that I want to point your attention to. Around noon, here you can see Sonia Gandhi is on as in a roadshow, and she's being hoisted out of from the side of her car, and she's waving at crowds. Roughly an hour later, the visual changes. Now she has changed her cars, and now she's sort of looking slightly different, and she's emerging from the sunroof of her car a bit more elegantly. What interested me and what fascinated me about this change of visuals, which happened over the course of an hour, was that this decision to change what car to use, how to look, how to appear, was not taken by Sonia Gandhi herself or her security detail for security reasons, or it was not even a suggestion by local party workers. This suggestion came from this man, which for most of you will be quite identifiable by this point. The decision came from Prashant Kishore, who was monitoring the entire roadshow, safely ensconced in a hotel a few miles away. And he was getting real life updates from his party employees, who are pictured here in black polo shirts and blue jeans, who were stationed on the rooftops along the route of the roadshow and who were giving him real life updates. And the entire roadshow was his strategy of launching the Congress Party's campaign, and the change of cars, the change of visuals was also his recommendation that he made sure happened. Um, in some ways, this is then the story of professionalization of Indian politics. How tasks related to election campaigns and electoral politics that were once taken within party structures, within by politicians and their party employees, have gradually been outsourced to a class of expert professionals who use a language of technology and managerialism to manage election campaigns and, by extension, India's democracy. I should say that I first got interested in this topic in 2014, which, as some of you might remember, was widely celebrated as India's first social media campaign. And back then, when I was a master's student, I was a master's student. I was really starting to understand what really went behind BJP's 2014 campaign being so social media heavy. But when I did fieldwork, what I was struck by was that while there was a lot of conversation on social media was really the tip of the iceberg. What was changing was a much deeper grammar of politics, how the way campaign party offices were being restructured. They were no longer these paper strewn offices, but they had become these slick machineries where technology and the modus operandi had changed. And how the expertise that parties were drawing upon was also radically different. It belonged to, as I said, a class of professionals, not your humble karyakarta who had been slogging for years on the ground. Um, and this then is what I call the story of professionalization. Let me give you another example. This visual comes from 2017 when I was doing field work in the Punjab, sorry, 2022, when I was doing field work during the 2022 Punjab Legislative Assembly elections. And here you have a wall mural that has been painted in a village in Faridkot with the Congress Party's slogan. Now, again, there's nothing inherently professionalized about wall murals. They've been as old as India's first general election campaign. But what's so interesting here is that it wasn't the case that a local politician paid a local painter to paint this mural, but rather the Congress Party in that campaign had hired a political consulting firm, which then got in touch with some local artists and painters, and handed them smartphones. And they said that we will only pay you for your work if after painting this wall mural, you take a picture of it, which is geotagged, and you send it back to us, right? And this then allowed the campaign party headquarters to map just how deep its visuals, its symbols, its party propaganda had reached in different villages. And then it could do its big data analysis, right? So simple, ordinary tasks that once have always existed are now being done by different actors and are now being done by different technologies. And that then becomes the story of India's professionalization of politics. So this then is the argument of the book that so far we have very elaborate accounts of parliamentary politics, elections and voter behavior, civil society activism, and so on, so far we haven't focused so much on what I call the backstage of democracy. This is the hidden arena where politicians and their advisors work behind the scenes to plan, deliberate, and strategize on how politics should be mentioned. And once you start analyzing and start taking seriously that there is such a thing called the backstage zone of politics, the backstage zone of democracy, that you realize that a deep change is taking place in India's politics that can be called as professionalization. Um, in the next few slides, I will quickly rush through it because I don't think it's very important for what we have to talk about. But I will say that one of the challenges that I encountered early on in this project was that I wanted to talk about where India's democracy had come to, and with these rise of these campaign professionals. But I was quite struck by the fact that hitherto there had been no systematic study of how election campaigns in India have evolved. Right. So I feel like, as scholars of Indian politics, as scholars of development in the broader sense of the term, we are often concerned with what are the outcome of elections. And those are important, right? Outcomes of elections determine what happens in policy making and politics. But often I think we don't take seriously the journey of election campaigns that get us there. And I want to put to you that the journey, studying the journey and how that journey has evolved, is just as important as taking focus on the outcomes that elections often throw up. So in the book, one of the things that I do in chapter 3 is I categorize how we can club different chunks of India's election campaigns since the very first election. And in the book, I argue that the first phase of election campaigning in India was one that we can call as the pedagogical campaign. I call it the pedagogical campaign because this is a moment when the newly enfranchised citizens are almost being taught how to be citizens, how to be voters. And the kind of party propaganda that's being produced is not so much about partisanship as it's about teaching voters in this newly enfranchised nation, this newly independent nation, how to become citizens proper. This is then followed by what I call the populist campaign, when Indira Gandhi's figure is the most prominent, but there are, of course, other populist leaders in the fray. And I call it the populist campaign not because simply populist slogans are being said, India is Indira, Indira is India, or Garibi Hatao, but rather I argue that there's something in the structure and design of campaigns. Who is handling a campaign? Who is giving suggestions to figures such as Indira Gandhi, that has a populist impulse in it. Because what these strategies of communication and electioneering that come to the fore in this period are all about connecting a mass leader to the masses without any sort of intermediation in between. Then, of course, is the most exciting phase, which is of the mediatizing campaign. And here I'm thinking about media forms and all their diversity, from the explosion of print newspapers that a scholar such as Robin Jeffrey has talked about, which takes place 80s onwards, to the rise of 24/7 news channels in India, to the fact that commercial internet services arrive in India in the mid 90s and the BJP becomes the first political party in India to launch its website in 1996. And it is in this period that politics that imbibes a mediatized logic. And it is this argue on the basis of this mediatizing impulse that we end up with the professionalized campaign. And what I want to point your attention to is that while most journalists and most some other scholars who have written on this field say that professionalized campaigning arrived in the 2014 election, when Prashant Kishore became so prominent. I actually date the start of professionalized campaigning from 2009. And one of the things that I show in the book is that while Prashant Kishore is certainly the most famous political consultant in India today, he is by no means the very first. The industry was already thriving at least a decade before he became such a prominent fixture in our news cycle. And I'm happy to talk about and discuss this more in the Q&A. So this for me is how we can understand the evolution of campaigning. And I take seriously the argument that it's not simply the result of elections that should concern us, but there's something about how elections are conducted in and of itself that I think tells a story about social change. I'll quickly skip over this, but we can come back to this later. I now want to get into the second part of what I want to talk about today, which is that if India has gone through a process of professionalization, why did it take place? And why did it take place, let's say, starting roughly around 2009, 2010? As I said before, what I'm calling professionalization has, of course, been studied in other parts of the world. And if you look at the academic literature that has come out of North America or Western Europe, scholars have pointed out certain variables which they believe help explain why professionalization takes place. I will focus on two of these here. The first prominent explanation that is often given to explain professionalization is technological change. The argument goes that as technology, particularly media technology, has become more and more sophisticated, it is but inevitable that political parties have had to rely on specialists. The argument goes that your humble karyakarta will not help you run elaborate data science based techniques of campaigning. They will not help you create the most catchy jingles or the most catchy Instagram reels to grab the attention of voters. Hence, you will need to bring professionals on board. Now, I find this argument persuasive, but what I want to argue is that if you were to look at technology itself, it would only explain part of the reason why Indian politics has professionalized. And the best argument I can give to you is that the 2014 general election, where, by the way, I should say that, when I present this in person, I like to keep it more interactive, but since this is on Zoom, I'll sort of try to just share this data point. One of the best points that I can give you is that in 2014 general election, which is widely celebrated as India's first social media election, only 2% of India's population was on Twitter. Only roughly 9% had Facebook account, right? So the amount of effort that a party such as the BJP was expending to reach out to voters through social media was not justified by the scale of the voting age population that was using social media for consuming politics. So something else was clearly going on. Look, let's look at the second explanation that is often forwarded to explain professionalization. The second explanation that is often given is weakness of political parties, which is the argument that at one point of time, political parties used to be quite strong. They used to have wide membership, but over time, political parties have weakened. They have undergone a process of organizational collapse. And because organizationally they're not robust, you then bring on political consulting firms that provide a stopgap measure of organizationally strengthening yourself. Now, here again, this is something that's quite familiar to us. We do know that political parties in India have been weak for a long time. But again, I want to argue that this does not provide a full explanation because it does not explain the timing of when professionalization took place. We know, for instance, that Indira Gandhi splits the Congress Party in 1969, and the Congress Party has sort of been in a state of decline from the 70s onwards. While it has won elections since the 70s, but organizationally it has remained quite weak and it has struggled to become organizationally robust. Similarly, with the rise of regional parties, we do know that even regional parties in India revolve around the personality cult of a single leader. For instance, JDU, Nitish Kumar, or TDP, Chandrababu Naidu. And there is a general absence of organizational strength in India's political parties. Now, the question that should interest us is that if weakness in political parties has existed in India since at least the 1970s, why is it that campaign professionals only enter the scene in 2010s, right? So what's happening in the period of 40 years, whether it was not inevitable that the second parties become weak, campaign professionals and professionalization suddenly takes off? Something else is surely going on. What I want to put to you is that in the existing literature, which has emerged out of the experience of Western democracies, scholars have only focused on what I call these demand side variables. And I call these demand side variables because they try to explain why campaign professionals are entering the picture by explaining why parties and politicians are demanding their services. Hence, these are demand side variables. Instead, I feel what scholars have forgotten to ask, and which becomes so important to ask in the case of India, is to ask what are the supply side variables, which is why are ordinary folks, people I would say many of whom might be here in the audience as students, why might they be interested to join a firm such as IPAC, or why might they be interested to become a data scientist for a political party? What is motivating people to become campaign professionals? And it is here that I argue that what needs to be explained is how there was a change in the political culture of India's middle class in the post 1990s period after India's economic liberalization. And the argument for the book is that in the post 90s period, we saw a process by which the middle class in India, what is often called the new middle class, because this is the middle class that benefited from liberalization rather than state led development, this middle class became quite disenchanted with the conventional channels of party politics. There was an increasing sense that the existing channels of politics are broken, they're not representative, and ordinary middle class folks can't enter these spaces. So instead, I want to argue that professionalization offered a new route to this particular sociological component of India's population. It provided them with a new route to engage in politics. And this was a new route because this wasn't about being a karyakarta, signing up as a member of a political party, and then fighting local elections and hopefully hoping that one day you will get a Lok Sabha ticket. Rather, this was a more direct entry into politics where one could leverage their expertise as a manager, as a data scientist, as an engineer, and leverage their skill in technology and data to start advising politicians and hence be taken seriously. And I think what I argue is that not just in India, but perhaps more globally, we need to think about how these supply side variables are often a crucial mechanism and a crucial reason why professionalization of politics takes place. Prachi, how am I doing in terms of the time?
Uh, I think you've been going on for 20 minutes, so maybe 15 to 20 more minutes you've got.
Perfect. And then in the third part of what I want to talk about, I want to talk about how is this then professionalization manifesting itself? Where are the different ways in which this pops up and what is happening inside India's democracy, or how it's helping us explain social change? Now, I do believe that this term professionalization can be quite big. So what I do in the book is that I decompose it into two parts. One is what I call internal professionalization, which is about how parties are internally changing themselves, how every party these days in India is creating a social media wing, a research department, a data analytics center. And this is a story of internal professionalization where party employees work. The second story is what I call external professionalization, which is not about their permanent centers in every political party, but this is the world of political consultants. Consultants who are hired on a case by case basis, on an election by election basis, whose association with parties ends and starts at very clean and clear points. So let me start by talking about internal professionalization. One of the classic theories of internal professionalization comes from the scholar called Angelo Paine-Bianco, who argues that all political parties in the world have gone through certain phases, a phase of mass party, a catch-all party, and then in an era of in the era that we're living in, it's an electoral professional party where the strength is not that of a party bureaucrat, not of a, let's say, a general secretary, but these party employees who work behind the scenes. To test this theory, I sort of focus in this book largely on India's two biggest national parties, Congress and the BJP. And I have to say, this was I sort of what I tried to do in these two chapters in the book is I tried to chart how is it that these two parties started taking the process of professionalization seriously. And this was really an exciting period and an exciting bit of the research to focus on because, what I really tried to do here was look at how political advertising first comes to India. And the posters that you see in front of you, some of you might recognize them, others they might seem a little unfamiliar. They are from the 1984 general election campaign after Indira Gandhi is assassinated and Rajiv Gandhi is fighting as the prime ministerial figure for the Congress party. And what makes these newspaper advertisements, and these are from the Times of India and Bharat Times respectively, what makes these newspaper advertisements so fascinating to me is that this was the first time in the history of independent India that on an extremely large scale, a political party had hired the services of an advertising firm to run its campaign. And for this campaign, the Congress party hired a company called Rediffusion Private Limited. Many of you might know the website Rediff. Rediff, of course, emerges from this parent company, which is an advertising firm called Rediffusion. And just to tell you just how different things look like back in the 1980s, what you have here on the left-hand side is how big a BJP's campaign advertisement looked like. And you can see it's in the tiny little corner and it's barely visible to us in the Bharat Times. In the very same issue, in the 7th December issue of 1984, you have Congress Party's campaign advertisement taking up the entire space. And it's far more professionally designed by advertising copywriters. And what I would really want to emphasize is that it's actually the Congress Party that really starts and takes India on the path of relying on political advertisements and professionals. But here we are 40 years later, and the tables have completely turned. Now, of course, we see BJP as the party which is the most professionalized and has the most slick campaign machinery. And what this proves to you then is that there is not really a thing such as a first mover advantage when it comes to professionalization. Congress party certainly starts it benefits by it because it also has the political finance in the 1980s to do a lot of this, but the tables turn very quickly, very soon. Now, you can, of course, look at the two chapters in the book on the Congress and the BJP as case studies, but I think it's important to look at them comparatively and to compare BJP and the Congress's story of professionalization. And if you compare them, you would be forced to ask yourself two questions. The first question you would ask is that why is it that professionalization has made some parties such as the BJP stronger and has not really helped other parties such as the Congress electorally in the same way? And the second question you might ask yourself is that does professionalization always lead parties to dilute their ideology? Again, the scholarship which has come out of the West tells us that as parties rely on advertising professionals, spin doctors, pollsters, they become more geared towards the median voter. They don't become as ideologically hardline, and instead they try to base the appeal to the median voter. But of course, we see this is not true in the case of the BJP. It has not really changed its ideology even though it has started relying on all sorts of campaign professionals and all sorts of techniques of professionalization. Now, of course, I don't have the time to answer these questions in depth. The devil is in the detail. But if I had to give you a one-word answer, the one-word answer would be path dependence. It is something about the timing of when a party professionalizes itself that enables it to either benefit or not benefit from what professionalization has to offer. In the book, I argued that the Congress professionalizes from a place of weakness, from a place of organizational weakness, whereas the BJP already has a robust mechanism of organizational identity behind it. And hence, the impulse of ideological dilution never is quite strong in the BJP. So the path dependence, the moment at which, the conjuncture at which a party chooses to embark on this process matters for how organizationally robust it remains. Now, moving quickly on to external professionalization, this is the world of campaign consultants and such as Prashant Kishore, even though there's so many more who have come up in recent years. And the story of campaign professionals and political consulting firms is just so staggeringly new in India's democracy. And to explain that, I always like to give the statistic that in the year 2000, a scholar called Fritz Plasser did a global consultancy survey where he went to different parts of the world and he asked politicians in different parts of the world that have you ever used the services of a political consulting firm? And what is the future that you see for these political consultants in your country's democracy in the years to come? And in the year 2000, he found that 0% of India's politicians claimed to have ever used a political consultant, and 77% said that they had doubts that political consultants had any future in India's democracy. But of course, we know only a decade later, this was a thriving industry. A 2014 Asokam report says that, these are the figures just which says that this is the scale of the industry. And now 11 years on, we can easily multiply these figures by 3 times, if not more. And these are guesstimates at best, right? There's never been, because you don't have to register your firm, there's no category such as a political consulting firm, which is recognized in Indian law. These are just simply guesses that we have on how we've estimated the size of the industry. So to explain why campaign professionals such as Prashant Kishore entered, what I really do is that I assembled an original data set of the people who worked on Prime Minister Modi's 2014 campaign in this organization called CAG, Citizens for Accountable Governance, which at that time was being mentored by Prashant Kishore. And I tried to understand who are the people who are working in CAG, what was the socio-demographic profile of people who are working in CAG. And what I found so astounding was that the average age of a CAG member was 24 years old. Yeah, so very fairly young. These are the folks who are doing the fancy chai pe charcha sort of video conferencing campaigns. And if you work backwards, you then realize that this is exactly the socio-demographic group that has grown up in post-liberalization India. And this is exactly the beneficiaries. This is exactly the new middle class. And when you look at the educational profile, the kind of work that they were doing, the kind of subjects that they were studying in university, it convinces you then that this then indeed is the upwardly mobile urban new middle class of India. But then I also draw upon semi-structured interviews that I've done with these political consulting firms, both with members of IPAC, but also other political consulting firms, where I try to understand why is it that they're joining this profession? Why is it that many of them who have worked in McKinsey, Bain, Deloitte, all of these big consulting firms, who have worked as investment bankers, engineers, why do they leave these professions and start working in a political consulting firm? And one example that keeps coming up, and one explanation that comes up with remarkable frequency, is that they say that they're trying to clean up Indian politics through this profession. Sure, it's they're earning money. Sure, there is a monetary logic behind a lot of this. But what they also believe in is that by introducing the language of data and technology, and by running campaigns in this more professionalized managerial way, they feel that they're making Indian politics a far more ordered, a far more sanitized, a far more predictable place than the messy, disordered, and corrupt place that it had supposedly become. Now, I want to say that we don't need to believe them that they're actually doing this. But what's important is to take their justification for their profession quite seriously, because it provides us with a worldview, an entry point into their worldview of why is it that they do what they do, why they entered this space in the first place. And I will just briefly make this point that, it's important for me to explain that this is not simply an India-based story. I have looked at political consultants that work in other parts of the developing world, such as APC Africa, which is a consortium of political consultants based in different African countries, or those that work in East Asia. And when you go on their website and when you look at the kind of language they use to justify their own activities, you find that they use it in the same language that a figure such as Prashant Kishore does, which is that he's cleaning up politics, he's here to make politics a better space. It's not simply about a financial logic that explains why these folks enter this domain at all. And I'll briefly make this point that, what I find quite frustrating in current media commentary is that most people only focus on the top level bosses of these consulting firms. So they'll only focus on Prashant Kishore. Prashant Kishore is the only person who will help us explain what happens in a political consulting firm. But what I try to do differently in my book is look at the middle level employees, the people who do the actual day-to-day nuts and bolts work of how a campaign is managed, to understand what exactly is a political consulting firm changing and not changing. And that's something that I try to unpack in the very last chapter of the book. But what I want to do now is perhaps focus on conclude by talking about the larger takeaways that hopefully can be a base of our discussion. The first thing that I hope the book really convinces people of is that we do need to take the backstage as a zone of politics, as a zone of democracy more seriously. We focus too much on the outcomes of what elections throw up, but we don't focus enough on what gets us there, what is happening behind the scenes. And of course, it's difficult methodologically to study this space because researchers are not welcome, journalists are not welcome, political parties increasingly don't operate in an open, transparent way in which these things are discussed. So there are methodological challenges in studying the backstage of democracy, but I think it's more important than ever before. The second thing I think we need to think about is intra-party organizational change. For a long time, of course, we know that India has gone through a process of what is called the Mandalization of politics. And many scholars, Christoph Jaffrelot, Sanjay Kumar, there's so many others who have helped us explain how, when you look at the sociological profile of MPs, MLAs, or even your ordinary general secretaries of political parties, there has been a change in which OBCs and Dalits have increased. Their representation has increased in these posts. While I think that has been one of the biggest successes of India's democracy, what worries me is that while at a representational level, Indian politics has become more representative and lower castes have certainly have come to the fore. But in the top echelons of politics, people who are actually making politics, people who are actually deciding who should get ticket, the kind of experts who are now surrounding party high commands are far more elite. So going back to the data set that I was talking about of the CAG data set, overwhelmingly they are upper castes, right? And we are then facing a paradoxical situation where while at a representational level, we have greater representation of who becomes an MP, who becomes an MLA, but at the level of the hidden elite that works in political parties, that is far and far more unrepresentative than it has ever been. The second thing is, of course, that this throws up a question about what do we mean by political participation? You know, Political participation often we think about as attending rallies, becoming a party member, doing some sort of volunteering and devoting your time to political parties. But what things such as CAG and IPAC throw up is how the a certain segment of the population, which is the urban, upwardly mobile, new middle class citizens, they're looking at new forms of political participation because they consider existing channels of party politics to be broken. And hence, becoming a political consultant for a few years, trying that out, becomes a new mode of not simply of earning a livelihood, which it certainly is, but also as a more clean, more sanitized, more technocratic way of political participation and what implication that has. This is the point I've already made, that what does concern me though is that while it has opened up new channels of political participation, while that is certain, but this is also reinscribing a power of a shadow elite, because these are people who work behind the scenes, whose identities are really not obvious to us, but the way parties function, the way parties nominate candidates are actually controlled by this shadow elite. And finally, I think, in a world where we're talking so much about disinformation, misinformation, post-truth politics, I feel by studying the backstage of democracy, we find a new entry point to think about disinformation. Not from the point of view of why is it that my uncle in this WhatsApp group is more likely to spread a piece of misinformation. Not looking at from the consumption of disinformation, but really looking at who are the producers of disinformation. Why is it that they're doing what they're doing? How do they end up justifying in their own languages and in their own worldviews about producing the kind of political propaganda that they produce? And I think often we need to understand things from this production side as much as we think about who is susceptible to disinformation and what does that do. So I'll stop here, and I really look forward to your comments, thoughts, questions, and suggestions.
Thank you so much, Amogh. It was a really insightful and a very deep analysis on ways in which our political campaign is always evolving and changing, and with increasing digitalization and advent of AI, maybe in the next few years we'll see even more interesting happening. Interesting for this day, discussant Professor Prachi Huda to discuss her reflections and her take on this.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Abhinita. And thank you, Amogh, for this lovely presentation and also for this very timely and engaging book. I'd been meaning to read the book for quite a few months now, but I finally got a chance to just dig into it now. And also thank you to the participants for joining. So I basically begin by pointing out a few ideas that ground the theoretical framework of the book. And very interestingly and incidentally, these were also some of the things that we discussed in the class last week on theories of development in our MSc program. We looked at modernization theory and its promises of this linear progress, and also at the theorization of political culture, especially the works of Armand and Verba. And Amogh's book very effectively challenges these frameworks. In particular, the book shows us why the modernization paradigm is inadequate to explain contemporary political change, especially in the context of India. Rather than only focusing on voter preferences or institutional design, the book very wonderfully turns our attention to the supply side of politics, as Amogh discussed in his presentation, the ecosystem of political consultants, strategists, and party professionals who now play a central role in shaping electoral outcomes. A key concept that helps ground this analysis is that of political culture, and again, not in its older behavioral sense as an aggregation of survey responses, but in a rather more richer interpretive way. Amok draws from Lisa Waden's idea of culture as a semiotic practice and sees political culture as a system of meanings through which actors understand and act upon the political world. This allows us to see how technology is not just a tool, but is equally embedded in values, aspirations, and identities. Uh, a key argument in the book is about the professionalization of Indian politics and how it has restructured the relationship between politicians and the voters. With access to hyper-local data, like the example mentioned, and I found it pretty interesting how electricity bills are used as indicators of socioeconomic class. Politicians can now design highly targeted campaigns. This is a profound shift from older models where grassroots party workers or brokers were the main intermediaries. What I find particularly interesting, and this again builds on Amogh's analysis, is how this top-down data-driven approach is complemented by structured ground-level mobilization strategies. And a very effective example being the BJP's Panna Pramukh model. Here, each worker is assigned a page of a voter list. Typically, it has about, say, roughly 30 names, and they're tasked with maintaining personal contact. This suggests that the professionalization of politics does not merely displace local engagement, it rather reorganizes and intensifies it in different ways. Another area where I see Amogh's framework really opening up important questions is about the personalization of politics. The book traces how the rise of professional consultants intersects with the growing appeal of strong, centralized leadership, especially among India's middle class. But I also feel this can be pushed even further. So I've been noticing this thing, this trend on social media, especially Instagram, in the last few weeks. And it's basically about how political communication is increasingly visual and emotionally styled, but it's also taking up different forms. So these days, Rahul Gandhi's PR team is doing something very interesting in the last few weeks. It appears his presence on Instagram, especially we also see it in the recent Bihar made the rally that's happening against vote chori and whatnot. So it appears very carefully curated to portray him not only as a political leader, but as an emotionally available, nurturing, and even romantically appealing figure. There's a notable shift from conventional models of masculine political charisma, gesturing instead towards softer, more intimate form of connection with the voters. What one might describe as the crafting of an ideal man or a man written by women, or also quote unquote here, straight out of Pinterest, a very interesting caption I just saw today on Instagram. Similar was the case with Chirag Paswan a few months back, and how his portrayal blended into crafted aesthetics of accessibility and charisma. So this isn't just simply rebranding, but it's also reflecting a broader and larger shifting terrain of political meaning making, where new affective styles are emerging as forms of appeal. Another extension of Amogh's argument lies in how non-traditional actors are now central to political communication. We are seeing political parties increasingly collaborate with social media influencers to push government messaging and ideological narratives. This trend has been institutionalized, as was last year seen in the case of Uttar Pradesh government. The government came out with guidelines in 2024 that offered tiered incentives to digital content creators promoting government schemes, while also threatening legal action against content deemed anti-national. This to me illustrates that political consultancy today is not confined to high-level strategists, but it also includes a vast network of everyday cultural producers, many of whom are outside formal party structures. So these developments basically deepen the central argument of the book. Again, it's very well put in the concluding chapter, where Amogh says that modern political campaigns are not just carefully constructed, they're often designed to appear unconstructed. Very well put. The labor behind strategic messaging is hidden. The emotional register feels rather organic, and the spectacle of participation is very carefully managed. While concluding, the book very effectively reminds us that propaganda does not always rely on falsehoods. It also works by concealing its own making. So I hope this book sparks further reflections on how political communication is changing, and its larger ramifications on the electoral or democratic system of the country, different processes, and also not just the techniques of, say, political communication, but also, in terms of values and aesthetics as well. So thank you, Amor.
Thank you so much, Prachi. It's always such a pleasure when people can draw out the key points of your book better than you were able to. So thank you so much for those comments. And I think one point that I think I should have mentioned, which I perhaps did not focus so much on in the main presentation, is that you're absolutely right that this is also not just a story about elections, because what this really sets in motion is a much deeper revolving door into the realm of governance and political consultants too. So it's often the case that often influencers or a campaign manager that's helped out a certain politician becomes the OSD to that politician if they become a minister in the union government, right? Or that their firm then also gets some sort of a contract as a consultant to help in some social welfare delivery scheme. So this becomes a much deeper revolving door in which you start getting access to patronage that being in government provides to anyone. We have seen this in the case of Prashant Kishore when he helped Nitish Kumar win the election in Bihar in 2015. He was made vice president of the JDU and given what was effectively a cabinet level berth by the creation of this special purpose vehicle machine called the Bihar Vikas Mission, which of course never took off the ground, which is a separate story about why these things fail as spectacularly as they start. But the fact that he could get that simply by the virtue of making Nitish win that election says something about the kind of power you can enjoy even after the election is won. So it continues much deeper. Yeah. Should we take questions? Are there questions in the Q&A? I'm not sure.
Thank you,
Dr.
Prachi, for noting and highlighting these. Yes. Yeah,
I'm sorry.
I'll just open up. Yeah, I'll just open up this conversation for questions. We already have a question online, I think by Professor Suraj Kumar. Then we'll take other questions after that. So he's asking, are we conflating the increasing recourse to professional consultants? Indian politics has always had professionals among politicians. Are we conflating the increasing recourse to professional consultant with a fundamental change in the manner in which elections are fought? Or is it that the discourse in political campaigns has been influenced by professionals to become more issue-based or rational?
Hmm. So let me take the first part that professionals have always existed among in some ways. So again, my argument is not as sharp as saying that there's a clear juncture at which professionals enter and they were earlier not present and now they're present. In the book, one of the things that I show is that what is the kind of publicity material that the Congress Party produced for the very first general election campaign? And if you look at the scale of things that were being produced for the first election campaign, you see everything from documentaries that were being shown in cinema halls to printed material to gramophone records. And to produce each of this publicity material, you needed a certain amount of professional, right? So I accept the fact that there have been different forms of professionalized assistance that parties have drawn upon ever since the very first election. But I think what's really staggering, which I think would be hard to underestimate, is one, the scale of intervention, right? It's not simply that the party is coming to you, giving you what it needs to be produced in the documentary, but rather parties are now increasingly saying that you tell us what we should be saying. You tell us what should be in the manifesto. Go do a poll. Tell us what do the Dalits think. Tell us what do women from the Yadav community think. And that'll help us decide what we should be saying, right? So the scale of how much you're giving leeway for them to set your agenda has changed. The second thing that's also changed, I think, is the claims of expertise on the basis of which a professional is appointed, right? So if Indira Gandhi, for instance, had her own team, what is often called Kashmiri Mafia, the kitchen cabinet, you had Haksar, you had Kaul, you had DP Dhar, you had this wide range of people who were helping Indira Gandhi fight elections, help in a policy making process. So she had her own set of experts. But those were cultivated on the basis of loyalty and long-term experience. Whereas now you hire a professional not because they have stuck by you for decades and decades and then you start trusting them, but simply because they're a professional, because they have a fancy degree on their CV, simply because they come with work experience from an MNC. And that then supposedly qualifies them to be an expert, right? So the parameters of what makes you trust them has changed, even if professionals have always existed in some form or another. So that's how I would argue, but thank you for that question.
We have another interesting question from a research scholar, a PhD scholar from IIT Madras, YV Reddy.
Mhm.
So he's planning to do a case study of Andhra Pradesh elections where two political consultancies have been working on. And he wants suggestions from you how he should particularly focus on data collection. And it is also an extension, I think, of my questions regarding, I know you have focused on the two central parties,
Yeah.
but how do regional differences also in India, such as varying levels of media penetration, literacy, and popular culture, influence the strategies and effectiveness of campaign management? And how
Right.
someone who is doing a PhD and focusing on regional states such as Andhra Pradesh would go ahead with this? So, any suggestions for
So
him and answering my questions, Amogh?
great. Thank you for those kind words, Vivi. So yes, methodology is always tricky, right? So first thing I want to say is best of luck and my warm wishes. The project that you're embarking upon will be very interesting, and please do share it with me. I would love to read whatever you find. I think one thing that perhaps might be worth thinking about is what sort of research design you want to work with. So let's say the question you're trying to answer is one of effectiveness, right? That there are these two consulting firms working for different parties. Are you trying to answer the question why was one more, whether one was more effective than the other and why was one more effective than the other? Then perhaps I would encourage you to perhaps look at a bit more data-based approach, quant data-based approach, right? So you might work with the data set, look at what was already happening in the previous election cycle, what the result was, and how that's changed depending on which constituencies these consultants were working in. And that then you can combine with interviews, so on and so forth. But it might be the case that you're not interested in that sort of a quantitative research design, in which case I think your best bet would be to use journalists as your entry point into these spaces. Having worked for many years now in these domains, I've realized just how impossible to penetrate they can be. So the thing that best allows you to gain access, if access has been such a problem for you, would be to look at journalists who might be covering this and using them as entry points and then getting access to campaign office sort of spaces. I will say though that the other thing that is increasingly might be of help to you would be looking at and messaging consultants on LinkedIn. Like I'm always surprised by when I started doing research, when I did the first round of fieldwork circa 2015, 2016, it was impossible to even figure out who is working in IPAC. Now they just put it openly on their LinkedIn profile, right? It's almost an exercise in branding to say that I'm working in Showtime Consulting, which of course is a big consulting firm in Hyderabad. Showtime Consulting, I imagine, is one of the firms that you might be looking at. So I would say look at those strategies and really best of luck for this, what sounds like a really interesting project. Um, to respond to the question about regional parties, um, on the one hand, we know that this is not simply a regional story, right? One of the things that I show in the book is that if you look at one of the most extensive uses of political consultant in India was actually not BJP and Prime Minister Modi bringing on board Prashant Kishore, but it was actually Naveen Patnaik in Odisha who hires a consultant called Pallav Pandey in the 2009 election when there was both a general election but also a state assembly election in Odisha. And what we find there is that based on the kind of polling and the kind of IVR phone calls that Pallav Pandey helped Naveen Patnaik with, Naveen Patnaik decides to break up its alliance with the BJP because, as some of you might remember, BJD was in a seat sharing arrangement with the BJP until 2009, and then in that year it decides to break off, completely goes alone, and it wins handsomely. And that was on the basis of this consultant's feedback. What this, I think, illustrates is that it is true that national level parties have the financial resources, the human power, and just more resources available at their disposal that they can bring on board campaign professionals. But if you're in a state such as Odisha, where the structure of the party system has been so lopsided, where you do already do enjoy, and we do know that regional parties do enjoy independent sources of wealth, because often they have deep pockets in the, let's say, the mining mafia, the resource extraction mafia, it's really not much of a stretch for you to start hiring these consultants too. So there, I don't think being a regional party is really a drawback or a handicap to engage in approaches of professionalization. What is certainly true, though, I think, Abhinata, which goes to your question, is that we don't know whether regional parties use them slightly more differently than a national level party. And my guess would be, and this is something that needs to be checked, my guess would be that regional parties are often able to get more cooperation from political consulting firm. So you can have a Mamta Banerjee figure to whom the entire party machinery is devoted to in TMC, and hence West Bengal is a complete open field for Prashant Kishore to come in, suggest slogans, khela hobe, do everything, nominate candidates. Whereas when you're working with a grand old party such as the Congress, you will have 10 different faction leaders who will rebel and won't let Prashant Kishore do his thing, which is what happens when Kishore is handling UP in 2017, right? So I think one hypothesis that I think I've often found, but this needs to be tested by the next generation of scholars, is that regional parties perhaps can work better, and scale of parties often becomes a deterring factor to how well consultants can work.
Okay. So I think how much time do you have, Prachi, to take two more questions, right? Or more?
Yeah, we can take a few more.
Okay, okay. So I think Rinku is raising her hand, but before going to her, we have a question from Dharmanshu, who is asking, how is the tension between external political consultants and organizational members play out, determine the power the former holds? Does this political consultants, are they hired by bosses at the top level? So yeah.
That's an excellent question. So often it is believed that consultants are hired at the top level. And here again, I think this is because Kishore has become such a byword for the industry as a whole. Everyone thinks that a senior party leader will get in touch with Kishore or CAG bosses, and then it's a party-wide client. But actually, the majority of the business that political consultants get in India are from a one-on-one basis, which is to say that they work on with an individual MLA and an individual MP, which is why it creates a scenario where I could be a owner of a political consulting firm, and I'll be working with the BJP candidate in South Delhi, but I'll be working with a JDS candidate in North Bangalore, and a Congress worker in Kolkata, right? So this is what allows political consultants to work across party lines, which is an anomaly when you compare them with American political consultants. In the US, 90% of them are committed partisans, which is to say that they'll either work for the Republican Party or they'll work with the Democrats. But it's not as if you will find a consultant working constantly back and forth between different senators across and constantly switching allegiances, which is why I find the Indian case to be so interesting that here we have a situation where consultants have shown absolutely zero partisanship in how they take on clients. And that can only be explained as what Professor Suraj were raising, that it's not as if party bosses are always hiring the consultants for their entire party, but actually the bulk of the clients come from this one-on-one, individually negotiated basis.
Next question, I think Rinko. Anyone who wants to ask a question, Rinko, I think she has her hands raised for quite some time. So yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, but there's some problem with my camera. Sorry, it's not working.
That's fine.
So,
That's
thank you, Amogh, for a very engaging presentation. Like from the very beginning, and very nuanced and very extensive.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I also like the outcome. I find it very fascinating, the outcome of shadow elite, right? So
Yeah.
when the post reforms, the media diversified, like there was explosion of especially television news channels, regional, national, etc. But if you see the profile of the journalists, they only come from a particular upper caste
Very true.
framework. And therefore, accordingly, some of the strides that were made in terms of inclusiveness of representation were narrowed down post reforms. So they
Yeah.
were also responsible for coining terms like the CEO of Andhra Pradesh, who was none other than Chandrababu Naidu.
How would I do?
But how can you? There's a dissonance with democracy, right? Because how can you call a chief elected, who's an elected representative, a CEO, where a CEO is never elected, right? It also happens when denigrate people from coming from the middle caste. so-called middle caste, and Lalu Prasad Yadav was a prime target of this. I'm not condoning his corruption or anything, but the way the media tend to be very partisan in kinds of representation. So, and I think this is the 2.0 in terms of consultancy, where the shadow elites emerge, because they have social capital and the what capital of networking, right? Because if you see, Prashant Kishore himself was abroad, he gets his experience, and then he comes and uses India to kind of experiment. So therefore the outcomes are very I find it very fascinating. If you can, yeah.
No, thank you for that. I think you're quite right that there is a story to be told about how media elites intersect with political elites and a hidden political shadow elite. But there again, what's so staggering is that even the fact that 90, God knows what the actual statistics are, but we know, for instance, it's well over 90% of all media editors and owners of English language press in India are upper caste, right? This is such a ugly secret of Indian society. But of course, there, even then, if we were to compose the sociological profile of these media editors, we know we can do that. What's so interesting about the shadow elite that I was working with this in this book is that, let's say I want to create a ethnic head count of them, I don't even know where to begin, because it's not as if a list is even maintained about who are the people who advise the BJP, who are the people who advise Samajwadi Party. It is so hidden because there's no sampling framework that one can even begin with to do an ethnic headcount. That is why I think it's so insidious and worth thinking about. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, it's very insidious, like you have suggested, and also the very fact that this whole denigration of politics itself. That
Yeah.
political parties do everything remote control. You're not supposed to go to the people. You're not supposed to talk to them. You're not supposed to mobilize. Because mobilization itself is demonized, kind of. In so
Yeah.
many ways. So it's all the conjunctures are too much. I mean, it's like the convergence of
Yeah.
this, and also like, for instance, why it's become so rabid now? Because digital technology primarily, isn't it? Everybody has a handset, and you can see these visuals. When the Paswan Junior campaign, so at night, so he would switch off the lights and all, and just through the mobile light, they would kind of, there's so many like news news reels that one can see. So the thing that the demand for responding, the demand for quick and immediate kind of solutions, they're all converged with, and where it's that politics is somewhat hollowed out. I don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
just yeah.
No, I agree with that, certainly. And it goes to the point you were making about Chandrababu Naidu being called the CEO of Andhra Pradesh, right? What that shows is this vision of a single leader who will cut through the red tape, who will do things directly, a man of efficacy, right? That is the fantasy. And what I find interesting is that, of course, everyone here who's present for this talk will know that there are problems with Indian politics. There are problems with our MPs and our elected representatives. But what bothers me with a lot of the political consultants I work with is the casteist logic by which they denigrate politicians, right? So when they say that, oh, politics has become dirty, disorderly, a lot of it was simply a cipher for the Mandalization of Indian politics, which took place in the 90s, after the 90s period. So it's not as if India had a golden age of politicians and suddenly all of them became corrupt. What a lot of anxiety I could feel with these folks was the focus that suddenly language of politics had become inflected with caste, which they felt, oh, suddenly as upper caste, there's no more space left in it for us. And I think we really do need to take this caste-based anxiety that often drives this perception that all politics is dirty, sab neta chor hai, right? I don't think we talk about that enough, and the kind of solutions that then throws up are very much part of the same story.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Who should we take next?
We have the next person, I think Dr. Nayan Jyoti.
Hi.
Dr. Nayan Jyoti.
Hi.
Nayan, are you
Hi,
there?
Amogh.
Can you hear me? Yeah,
Yeah,
please go ahead.
if you can hear me. Yeah, great presentation. I especially like this sociological investigation into the new middle classes. If I can call it so, this book that you referred in terms of the transition between the mass party to the, so I have three comments. One is this. So
Yeah.
the mass party to the electoral professional party, this transition, and the professionalization of politics. So it's like kind of from, let's say, commitment to tasks being outsourced. Uh, if that is the difference, then how does it impinge back on these parties themselves within the internal structure? Specifically, I'm thinking of, let's say, which is a specific case in India, which is of the BJP and the RSS
Yeah.
linkages. So not talking generally, but specifically if one investigates that, because that is a specific kind of, let's say, the initial conception of mass parties also from Lenin's party of professional revolutionaries, it's something like that. I mean, the RSS itself is constituted of that. And then they use that, as well as they are quite adept at using the external consultants. Then how does it impinge back on their own structure? Even in terms of, let's say, how slogans will play out. What slogans, what axis needs to be now sharpened? So how does that work? Because, okay, I mean, one gets your argument of, let's say, the new middle classes, then they would have their caste class baggage and that kind of a dominant ideology, which they will think will work. Maybe it won't. But the internal consultants would rather maybe in be a better position. How does that kind of thing play out? Is that a thing? So that was one. The second is around this professionalization in terms of, we have seen, you have pointed to continuities in elections, but even in, we do say, teach development planning. I mean, the initial plan, in fact, we teach how, like going from Partha Chatterjee and so on, was supposed to circumvent politics and ideological debates, and then to institute a certain version of professionalized politics. And when we know that planning does not really occur only through professionalization, it has a political component. So there's a continuity on that level as well. That is the second one. The third is on this this whole question of the complete inequality and skewedness of technology and finance today, which is something actually new. I mean, Peter Thiel says this all the time, that how you circumvent politics through technology and so on. So especially in terms of the amount of money that is getting infused in it, is it like, I mean, how much of a radical break is it? And related to that, the question that I think Professor Suraj has also posited, that how much of it does it actually work? I mean, like, or is just a self-justification for them that, okay, we are trying to circumvent it. Maybe it does not really work. I mean, we have seen the India Shining campaign before it. We have seen a lot of such campaigns which have completely failed. So, okay, thank you.
No, thank you, Dr. Nayan Jyoti, for all of those questions. All of them are excellent. Firstly, what impact does this outsourcing of tasks have on parties, both in general, but in the case of the RSS-BJP relationship? Speaking in general, I've often come across instances where the outsourcing of tasks sometimes benefits ordinary party workers and local politicians, but also antagonizes them, right? So a party such as the Congress, which is so factionalized, if you say, yeah, I've done a poll and hence I'm giving the party ticket to this candidate and not the other, of course, local party workers will be disgruntled and they will not simply fall in line simply because you've done a poll on the basis of which you're deciding this, right? So the language of science and data doesn't always bring party workers on board with your decisions. These are inherently political decisions. Equally, I often found that often when you bring a political consulting firm on board and you help, let's say they help set up WhatsApp groups in a constituency and they create a channel of communication, political communication in the local area, local party workers can be quite happy with that. They'll be quite happy that finally someone came in, helped them set up something, they provided them with some sort of social media literacy and gave them some sort of help to get that started. So that's a more general picture. What's so interesting in the RSS BJP is that, on the face of it, you would expect that there'd be some friction between your dyed-in-the-wool Swayamsevaks who come with ideological purity and your professional who's only looking at polls and looking at what is the general, what is the general picture that they're getting through their opinion polls and surveys. What is so interesting about the BJP is that the point of contact between these professionals and the party is actually an RSS man. It's often the RSS Sangathan Mantri who actually works in collaboration with these folks. And I think it's because BJP has perfected this model that we're bringing these professionals on board, but not simply for them to dictate and tell us what our slogan should be, what XYZ should be. They actually put them in charge with a Sangathan Mantri, such as in the case of UP, which I've observed very closely, that ensures that the professionals never overreach what's their brief, but also the party never faces a compulsion of ideological dilution. I've often spoken to political consultants who, let's say, worked with Sanjay Joshi, a prominent Sangathan Mantri, who's often managed UP for the BJP. And they'll often find that, we'll often be hesitant that, does this man want to listen to our suggestions? Is he open to this thing or that when he has lived in this constituency for close to 2 decades? And they'll actually find that they're actually quite open-minded, that there is a sense of cooperation that you can expect, even from what seem to be on the face of it, the most ideological, hardline Hindutva supporters. And I think that is something that is so fascinating to me, but there's far less friction that one would imagine from a theoretical point of view between these professionals and the wider Sangh Parivar. On your second question, yeah, you're quite right that, as Chatterjee tells us, if one looks at the planning commission debates, every sort of planning, every form of developmental intervention was sort of be brought out of politics. But what fascinates me is the logic by which this was done, right? Earlier, it was about questions of democracy, a pedagogical impulse, about technical expertise. But now I think the impulse is grounded in more a caste-based logic, which I was alluding to earlier, that there's some sort of a uprise of lower caste that takes place in Indian politics in the post-90s period, for which you need the language of technocracy to come in and clean up something. So yes, in some ways, there's always an impulse towards depoliticization, but at different junctures, the legitimate reason why you want to depoliticize will differ. But yeah, I don't disagree that there's always been an impulse of depoliticization when you're working with technocrats in different ways. Your third and fourth points are very much linked, right? The question of political finance and the question of, are these consultants able to do any sort of positive impact? Are they able to win any elections by taking on a client? They are interlinked, and the short answer is no, right? I've asked this to politicians who are often in charge of deciding, do we go with Design Box, or do we go with Showtime Consulting, or do we go with some other advertising firm? I've asked them that, do you think they're actually helping you? Do you think that they're actually helping you in elections? And they'll tell you point blank no. And they'll say that we know कि आज ये हमसे पैसा ले रहे हैं, कल अगले इलेक्शन में दूसरी पार्टी के साथ जाके काम करेंगे. But the reason they do it is because of two things. The first one is a very simple reason: FOMO, fear of missing out. If you see an opposition party doing it, you're more likely to take them on board even if you don't believe in their efficacy, because you don't want to be lost out in that process. The second reason is the financialized logic of Indian politics, which is that if your average MLA or MP is a person with deep pockets, one who you're nominating simply by virtue of the fact that they can self-finance their campaign, then this is simply throwing spare change at the problem, right? If you've already nominated a person who has deep pockets, then it doesn't matter that you will spend a few lakh rupees and give this to a consultant to run your campaign, because this is loose change for you in the larger scheme of things. This is barely something that would even be considered a sunk cost. So I think the two things become very closely linked together. The financialized logic by which political parties have, one, access to large, vast sums of money, at least some parties, not all of them, but the logic by which a lot of them have access to corporate donations. But two, we know that, and Nilanjan Sarkar has written about this beautifully, that parties only tend to nominate, on average, wealthier candidates. This produces an inbuilt logic by which candidates then hire the services of these professionals, because for them, this is not much financially onerous.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more questions. Anyone? Please go ahead. Someone was raising
I
their
think
hand.
Himanshu had raised his hand for quite a few minutes. If he can
Yeah,
unmute
yes.
himself, maybe, yeah.
Hello.
Okay, he's
Hello.
not there, so I ask, yeah, why
Hello,
we can
am
go
I
ahead.
audible?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, I was pointing to something which Amogh has already pointed. Because I myself has worked for Inclusive Mind for a month, and that was to at the peak of the Chhattisgarh election. So my question was that uh, their argument was that they were not very much consulted about candidate selection, and I myself have seen that so many of the candidates who were supposed to get nominated were very disgruntled when they got to know that they were not. given the tickets, provided that the inclusive mind does not consider them to be a good candidate. So these factions inbuilt, especially in the Congress structure, impact the power these political consultants holds. Even in the case of, let's say, Congress, there are Rahul Gandhi holds a much more uh, position than in BJP, let's say. So I think the tussle between the local leaders and these political consultants decides how much power these political consultants actually holds over
Yeah.
these candidate selection. And at the same time, what I have observed is that these political consultants, especially who are external, are uh, hired before a year, so they don't have the means uh, to undo the problems which are inherently in the structure of the organization. So
Mm.
I would like to know what you think about it.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Dharmanshu. It's always lovely to actually get a question and engage with someone who's actually worked in the industry. Of course, I've interacted with folks for many years now, so I hope to base my insight on first-hand interactions. But please do drop in an email or let's stay in touch. I'd love to hear more about you. But based on what you said, I remember very early on going for an interview with a very senior political consultant who has been in this industry before Kishori was even around. And he said that often I have to tell my consultant, I have to often tell my clients when they come to me that, listen, I can't help you. I'll take on your business if you want me and I'll take the money, but I don't think I can help you win this election. And he said that ideally, if I were to help a client, I need to be brought on board at least 2 years in advance, right? Uh, this just goes to show that we're living in a permanent campaign mode. If consultants and people who are working behind the scenes really start working 2 hours before a state or the country even goes to the polls. So you're quite right. It really echoes with what many people have told me that you will of course get clients who in a hurry will say, please come and do our social media for us 2 or 3 months before a campaign. But really, if you're catching them early, you want to get them and you ideally need to have ears and you want a sustained engagement. That's the other thing a lot of consultants will look for. So that's certainly true. What you talk about in terms of, local candidates getting disgruntled if they don't get the party ticket. I think this is a story as old as time, at least in the Congress. One of the things that I show in the book is that, when Rajiv Gandhi comes to the fore in the 1980s, he starts this elaborate data gathering exercise in which this is not quite professionalization, but this is sort of proto professionalization where the Congress party gets a computer, it starts entering data about all past voting records and about all candidates and starts gathering local ground level reports about who's the more competitive, who's the most popular local leader. And it starts claiming that every nomination process that we go through for every state, it's done on a scientific basis. And it does so under Rajiv Gandhi in the belief that if we're using the language of data science, surely, hopefully, everyone will fall in line and everyone will know that we're not doing this because of some ulterior motives, but we're really doing this because we're taking the best decision in the party's interest. And they hope that everyone will fall in line. But that's never happened. It never happened in the 1980s, and it's not happening now. Simply saying that we have decided the ticket nomination process by doing a survey, by doing a consultation, by doing a focus group will never buy you peace from disgruntled leaders who have lost out on that ticket. What's required is a much deeper model of party building where you absorb discontented factional leaders in some other power sharing arrangement, right? That is the classical story of how parties do and how parties survive. Simply saying that you have hired professionals to take the most optimal decision will not buy peace.
Uh, Dharmanshu, do you want to go ahead and ask a question since you're raising hand for quite some time?
No, it's done. Thank you.
Okay. So I think we have one last question from Akif,
Mm-hmm.
who is asking, given your analysis of the professionalization of election campaigns in India, how do you assess the role of social media influencers during the model code of conduct silent period? Do they function as de facto campaign agents, perhaps operating through strategic messaging or voter targeting in ways that challenge or circumvent the intended spirit of regulatory neutrality? And should regulatory frameworks consider treating them as campaign professionals, deserving formal oversight?
Yeah. I mean, great question, Akib, but there are really two questions here, right? One is about the model code of conduct and its efficacy. The other is about social media influencers. And then, of course, the question is how do the two interact? I mean, I would argue that even if there wasn't such a thing as professionalization of Indian politics, even if, let's say, we bracket that, the shameful truth that's staring us in the face is that what has become the model code of conduct. It only exists on paper. It's not enforced. You can have many BJP politicians who gave extremely communal speeches in the 2024 general election, and nothing happened to them, right? It's just not enforced. So even before professionalization entered the space, we knew that MCC was not being enforced, and every politician across party lines was violating it flagrantly. Then, of course, comes to the point about when social media influencers come into the picture, how does one even regulate if one wants to regulate and enforce the provisions of MCC? As early as 2014, actually, you found that Election Commission of India had issued memorandums to all political parties that they had to register their social media handles. They had to register how much they were spending on social media as part of their annual filing of campaign expenditure and party accounts. But I think this speaks to the point that I note towards the end of the book and that Prachi highlighted that what's so striking about professionals is not simply that slick campaigns are created, but these are also campaigns that erase their own footsteps, right? So the fact that a party brings on board a social media influencer will never be able to be traced by looking at the party's accounts. And I recently published a paper on this in International Journal of Communication, where I sort of flesh out how then money flows hands, which makes it so impossible to trace. But I think the entire industry of social media influencers we know are often in cahoots with different political parties. But it has become simply impossible to trace. And it's a regulatory solution that I struggle to come up with, but it's certainly one that I think we at least need to talk more about and think of it as a problem before we come with regulatory solutions, which are certainly needed for sure.
Okay. I think we are done with all the questions now. And given that it's such an interesting topic and with so many people who want to know more and want your opinion and a lot of other things, and I'm pretty sure if anyone wants to reach out to you, maybe they can do that at some point through
Absolutely. Please
mails.
do get in touch with me.
Yeah. And Prachi, thank you so much. And thanks everyone, our students of IMSc program and all those who joined from JGU and outside JGU. And thank you, Amogh, for doing this. I know it took a chunk of your time to do this, given your
I'm very
schedule.
happy to be here.
And really glad that you have done this masterclass with us. And thank you everyone for taking this time on a Saturday evening here and joining us for this session. And yeah, so I think we can end the session now. Yes,
Thank you
thank you,
so
Prachi.
much.
Thank you.